Ever since Alex Pereira took the UFC by storm, many wondered if we would see more Glory champions come into the UFC. Although a unique case, the marvelous striking of Alex Pereira translated beautifully into the MMA sphere. Pereira somewhat represented a new style of fighter within the UFC, a true striking practitioner. Phenom perhaps served as an inspiration for the new legion of brutal killers within the sport of martial arts. The UFC noticed Alex Pereira and his success within the UFC. Following his win over Sean Strickland, it was evident that Pereira would receive a title shot. In his first title fight, Phenom faced some adversity. However, we all know how this fight ended. In just a few short fights, Pereira became the first Glory champion to replicate the greatness within the octagon. And of course, this captivated UFC President Dana White's eyes towards replicating this with some other fighters. This is where Cedric Doumbe comes into the equation. With a lot of charisma in his arsenal, he isn't solely a fighter. You pair his offensive savviness with how defensively sound he is, and you have a tremendous fighter. Similar to Alex Pereira, Doumbe's style is primarily focused on his hands, providing a balance between body and head punches. And both are equally terrifying for slightly different reasons. Doumbe finds humor in the way he fights. Before we continue, make sure to check out our sponsors, MMA Cookie Cult and Octagon Kings MMA, for the best MMA bets out there. Shoot them a DM and say Martial Insight sent you. His MMA debut occurred in late 2021, as he'd fly all the way to Dubai to take on RB Imiev. Doumbe was the pound-for-pound best kickboxer at the time, which made it a big deal for him. He immediately surprised everyone with this sweep, leading him to land some ground and pound. A few good shots would be all it took for Doumbe to wrap it up in the first round.
But he's getting caught, and he's getting shot. It's a knockdown! Down he goes! Now, will he finish this?
For Doumbe, all it took were some small baby shots that evidently made all the difference. Doumbe's second bout was under the French promotion MMA GP. Similar to when he kickboxed, Doumbe balanced his attacks on the body and head. He would stalk his opponent like a lion would stalk his prey. Surprisingly, he also showed indications of a developed ground game. Doumbe won the fight after the official had seen enough and called it between rounds. Negotiations began with the UFC at this time. However, complications were inevitable. Doumbe was set to make his UFC debut at UFC Paris in September of 2022. However, contract disputes paired with French MMA rules didn't allow him to perform. Apparently, his lack of MMA experience deemed him ineligible to compete in France. Essentially, he'd only be allowed to fight someone with a similar record to him. It was also discovered during that time Doumbe had blood in his brain, a problem he needed to tend to as well. It was unfortunate, but the UFC was forced to eliminate the contract, and Doumbe would have to honor his MMA GP contract. His next fight would be even more impressive, as he'd get a quick knockout. In an outstanding fashion, Doumbe would land big hooks on his opponent and proceed to stalk him through the cage, only to land a devastating knee to the body. At this point in time, the UFC wanted Doumbe even more. However, we'd see problems. Doumbe announced on the Helwani show that he would be making 10 times more than what was offered to him by the UFC by signing with the PFL.
I really had a very better contract with PFL, and PFL is the future, you know. I'm very glad with my contract right now, and I know I will show a great Cedric Doumbe for France, for Cameroon, for Africa.
Now, we all know that Dana White has his doubts about the PFL, particularly now that they have signed prolific heavyweight Francis Ngannou.
I know how the story ends. I get what Francis is doing. I wish the PFL all the luck in the world. I wish him all the luck in the world. It's just not what we do here.
His strained relationship with Francis Ngannou doesn't help the situation either. You add that to the fact that the PFL signed influencer boxer Jake Paul to the mix, Dana White obviously is going to get upset. Paul made it clear that his intention with the PFL was to ensure fighters receive at least 50% of the revenue. Dana made it clear that the UFC's program is indeed balanced. People are making a big deal out of something that truthfully isn't a problem. However, this wasn't the first time Dana lost a fighter to the PFL, like Shane Burgos, for example.
Yeah. We're not perfect, but we don't f*** up often. We don't f*** up often, but that one up.
Many speculate if this move by Doumbe was at all influenced by Francis Ngannou. After all, both are from Cameroon, and both have had their issues with the UFC. Francis signing with the PFL didn't sit well with everyone, but it did indeed open doors. Doumbe has everything to be a superstar, and the PFL won with this one. The UFC is always looking for star power to replicate McGregor's success, but it is easier said than done. Doumbe had the potential to bring some fire to the UFC and truthfully alter the scenario a little bit. This all begs the question, did Francis Ngannou, who has a good standing relationship with Doumbe, push him to sign with the PFL? This also begs another question, is the UFC doing a good job signing new prospects? There are other prospects like Kayla Harrison who the UFC have failed to sign. At one point, Harrison was seen as the woman who would dethrone Nunes in the UFC, and unfortunately, they missed that opportunity. At 15-1, Harrison has one of the most interesting records within the MMA scene, and up to her last fight, she had not lost. Her storyline with the PFL, in addition to her $1 million per fight deal, makes it interesting. In comparison, Amanda Nunes, considered by many the best of all time, makes only half that in her fights. Now, how exactly does this go back to Cedric Doumbe? Nicknamed the best, Doumbe brings the energy and chaos the UFC needs at times. And to be paid 10 times more by the PFL than the UFC really sets a bad precedent for other future stars that are on their own come-up. First-time fighters usually make $20,000 to $30,000 per fight in the UFC. However, Doumbe is set to make more than that for the PFL. Allegedly, his contract with the UFC would consist of $20,000 for showing up and $20,000 if he won the bout. With the PFL, he is set to make at least $150,000 per event without counting bonuses. Ngannou's move out of the promotion may have had some influence in Cedric's decision. This all begs the question of if the UFC or if Dana White are losing their negotiation skills to smaller organizations. After all, $20K for someone like Cedric does sound criminal. With a UFC welterweight division filled with star talent, Doumbe's addition could have been insane, and his transition into the MMA scene could also prove that kickboxers do have a good base for the sport of martial arts. Hopefully Cedric does sign with the UFC in the future, and we can avoid asking all the what-ifs. As per usual, please do not forget to drop your like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks.